morning my mother chose my best friend over me, she was wearing the same blue cardigan she'd worn to my university graduation. I remember thinking, how strange that a piece of clothing could carry two of the most important moments of my life and make both of them hurt. I'm 31 years old. I'm a registered nurse at Vancouver General Hospital, working the cardiac unit, night shifts mostly because that's what you take when you're still paying off your student loans and splitting a one-bedroom apartment in East Van with someone you thought you could trust forever. My name is Nora, and this is the story of how I lost almost everything I'd ever built. My relationship, my home, my closest friendship, and very nearly my sense of who I was, and how, without planning any of it, I ended up standing in a hotel ballroom in downtown Vancouver, watching the two people who destroyed me realize exactly who I'd become. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's always been my problem, jumping to the part where things make sense, skipping over the years when nothing did. I met my best friend Claire in our first year of nursing school at UBC. She was from Kelowna, loud in the best way, the kind of person who would sit next to you in lecture when every other seat was open and say, "You look like you know what you're doing, can I copy your notes?" with absolutely no shame. I didn't know what I was doing, but I lent her my notes anyway. That was 12 years ago. For 12 years, I thought that was one of the best decisions I ever made. She moved in with me after second year because rent in Vancouver's what it is. You either have parents paying for your condo or you have roommates, and my parents were both working labor jobs in Port Coquitlam and could barely cover their own mortgage. Claire's family had a bit more. Her dad owned a landscaping company in the Okanagan. She'd grown up with more breathing room than me, but she never made me feel it. That was what I loved about her. She made everything feel even. My boyfriend at the time was a man named Daniel. We'd been together for 4 years when this story really begins. He was in construction project management. Not the trades, the office side, and he was good at his job and he was charming in that quiet, reliable way that I'd always been drawn to. We weren't flashy. We went to Granville Island on Saturdays. We cooked dinner most nights because restaurants in Vancouver had gotten genuinely absurd. We talked about eventually moving somewhere with a backyard. Burnaby, maybe? Or Coquitlam, closer to my parents. We had a plan that felt real. Claire knew Daniel almost as long as I had. She was the one who'd pushed me to say yes to the second date when I'd convinced myself I was too tired for relationships. She was at every birthday dinner, every New Year's Eve, every lazy Sunday where the three of us watched whatever playoff game was on and ate too much takeout. She was in the photos on my phone. She was in the stories I told. She was, I thought, the one person outside of Daniel who actually saw me clearly. I was working a stretch of night shifts last February, 4 in a row, cardiac unit, the kind of week where your body stops understanding what time means and you start surviving purely on Tim Hortons and spite. Daniel had been distant. I'd noticed, but I'd told myself it was his project, a condo development in South Surrey that was over budget and behind schedule, and he'd been stressed about it for months. I told myself that because it was easier, because the alternative required energy I didn't have. I came home on the fourth morning, a Thursday at around 7:15. I remember the light in our apartment, that flat gray February light that comes through the windows in East Van and makes everything look like a waiting room. I was still in my scrubs. I hadn't slept. I had my bag over one shoulder and my keys in my hand, and I opened the door and I didn't even process what I was seeing for a full 3 seconds. Claire was in my kitchen, in my apartment. She was wearing Daniel's sweatshirt, the old gray UBC one he'd had since before I met him, and she was making coffee like she lived there. Daniel was sitting at our kitchen table, the same table we'd found at a thrift store in Strathcona, and carried up 3 flights of stairs together. He was in yesterday's clothes. He looked at me and he didn't say anything. Nobody said anything. I remember setting my keys down on the little hook by the door, very carefully. Like, if I did it quietly enough, the whole scene would rearrange itself into something that made sense. It didn't. What followed was the kind of conversation that leaves marks, the kind where the other people have clearly talked through what they're going to say, and you're the only one who has to improvise. Claire cried. She kept saying she was sorry, that it had just happened, that she'd been going to tell me. Daniel was calmer, which was somehow worse. He said he cared about me, but that something between him and Claire had been building for months and he hadn't known how to stop it. Like it was weather. Like it was something that happened to him. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I sat down on our thrifted couch in my nursing scrubs and I listened to my boyfriend and my best friend explain to me how they'd fallen in love with each other while I was working nights at a hospital trying to keep people alive. And then I picked my keys back up and I left. I drove to my parents' place in Port Coquitlam. My mother opened the door and I walked in and sat at her kitchen table, the same kitchen table I'd done homework at for 18 years. And I told her everything. She made tea. She listened. And then she said something that I've spent the last year and a half trying to understand. She said, "Claire called me last week." I looked at her. She was upset, my mother said. She didn't know what to do. She said she didn't want to lose either of you. "She called you," I said. "She was scared, Nora. She's been your best friend since." "She was sleeping with my boyfriend." My mother looked uncomfortable in a way that told me everything. I know it's complicated, but Claire, she's been such a big part of this family. I don't want this to be something that ends. Ends what? Our friendship? I stood up. Mom. I'm just saying that these things are never black and white. I left my parents' house that morning too. I drove around the Lower Mainland for 2 hours. I ended up in a Tim Hortons parking lot in Coquitlam eating a breakfast sandwich I didn't taste, watching a woman 2 cars over share a Timbit with her dog, and thinking about how my mother had known for at least a week that something was happening between my best friend and my boyfriend, and had said nothing, had chosen to comfort Claire instead of warning me, had decided that preserving Claire's feelings mattered more than giving me the chance to walk into my own apartment prepared. That was the part that stayed with me longer than the betrayal itself. Not Daniel. I'd loved Daniel, but love at 31 is more clear-eyed than love at 24, and some part of me could eventually metabolize the end of that relationship. But my mother had looked at me at the kitchen table and chosen, very gently, to take the other side. The months after that were the kind of months that don't make good stories because nothing dramatic happens. You just survive them. I found a new apartment, a bachelor in Mount Pleasant, which is all I could afford on a single nurse's salary in the city, and which smelled like whoever had lived there before me had kept a dog and strong opinions about scented candles. I worked. I slept badly. I called my dad sometimes, who was careful and kind and clearly being pulled between 2 sides of something he hadn't asked to be part of. I didn't talk to Claire. I didn't talk to Daniel. I blocked both of them on everything, not dramatically. I just quietly removed the access points. This was, I came to realize, the first genuinely clean decision I'd made in a long time. I also didn't talk to my mother, not for several months. That was harder than I'd expected it to be. Not because I doubted that I had every right to step back. I knew I did. But because I was 31 years old and I was grieving 3 relationships simultaneously, and I was doing it largely alone in a bachelor apartment in Mount Pleasant. And there were evenings in those first months where the loneliness had a specific physical weight. It sat in my chest, just left of center, which is something they don't teach you in nursing school, even though they probably should. What I did instead of falling apart, I picked up extra shifts. I trained for the cardiac care nursing certificate I'd been putting off for 2 years. I started running, badly, along the seawall, in whatever weather came, because Vancouver weather doesn't ask you how you're feeling before it arrives. I made one new friend, a nurse on my unit named Patricia, who was 56 and from Trinidad and who had the particular kind of calm that comes from having already survived several things. She brought me soup once when I mentioned I was sick, left it at the nursing station in a container with my name on it, and didn't make it a big deal. I thought about that for days. Somewhere in all of that, without exactly meaning to, I started to rebuild. I applied for a charge nurse position at VGH. I didn't think I'd get it. I was younger than most candidates, and I'd spent the previous year barely holding myself together. But I'd built a solid record before everything fell apart, and the unit manager had seen me work. Really work. The kind of 3 a.m. work that shows you what someone's made of. I got the position. The pay increase was meaningful. Not Toronto Bay Street meaningful, but Vancouver nurse, finally breathing meaningful. I moved out of the Mount Pleasant Bachelor and into a 1-bedroom in Kitsilano, A real one-bedroom with windows that faced west and a balcony I could actually stand on. I bought a used couch that I carried up the stairs myself, not because I'm proud, but because there was nobody to call, and carrying things yourself turns out to be manageable once you stop waiting for help that isn't coming. I called my mother in October, about 10 months after I'd walked out of her kitchen. Not because everything was resolved, because I'd decided that carrying the silence was costing me more than the conversation would. She cried almost immediately. She said she had handled it wrong. She didn't defend herself as much as I'd expected her to, which made it easier. She said she'd let her relationship with Claire, 12 years of Christmas dinners and birthday texts and treating her like a second daughter, cloud her judgment about what her actual daughter needed. She said she was sorry. I didn't tell her it was fine because it wasn't, not entirely. I said I appreciated her saying it and that I needed things to be different. She agreed. We've been finding our way back to each other since then. Slowly, carefully, the way you rebuild something that's been weight-bearing and cracked. It's not what it was. It's different. I'm still figuring out if different can be okay. Claire and Daniel, from what I could piece together through the small-town grapevine that is any Canadian extended social circle, moved in together in Burnaby, the same Burnaby Daniel and I had talked about. I heard this through a colleague who knew someone who knew them. The way you always hear these things, quietly and too late to do anything but absorb it. I sat with it for a day, and then I went back to work. What I did not expect, what nobody could have planned, was the gala. VGH holds a fundraising gala every year in the fall. It's a big deal in the Vancouver healthcare community. Hospital administrators, donors, pharmaceutical reps, community partners, people who give money and people who need it, and people who are trying to be seen doing both. This past November, for the first time, I was invited as a charge nurse, part of a small cohort representing frontline clinical staff. The invitation came in a cream-colored envelope with the hospital crest on it, and I put it on my kitchen counter and looked at it for 3 days before I confirmed. I bought a dress. Navy blue, understated, the kind of thing that works whether or not you feel like being there. I did my hair. I took the Canada Line downtown from Broadway City Hall and walked to the hotel in the November rain, which is just Vancouver asking you to have humility. The gala was held in one of the large ballrooms at the Fairmont Hotel Vancouver, all high ceilings and dark wood and the smell of real money and past appetizers. There were maybe 300 people. I found the VGH table, sat with my colleagues, made small talk about hospital board things I barely understood, and drank 1 glass of wine very slowly because I was driving back to pick up Patricia's daughter as a favor and I needed to stay functional. I did not at any point in planning for this evening think about Daniel or Claire. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't positioned, I hadn't orchestrated anything, I wasn't wearing armor or carrying a speech. I had simply gotten dressed and shown up to a work event the way I now showed up to most things, not because I was over it, but because I had learned to go anyway. I was standing near the edge of the room by the windows, letting the noise of the ballroom drift around me when I saw her. Claire was across the room, maybe 30 feet away, standing with a group of people I didn't recognize. She was dressed up, a red dress, hair down, the look of someone who was very aware of how they appeared. Daniel was beside her, his hand at the small of her back. They looked like a couple. They looked like they'd been a couple long enough that it had stopped being something to hide. I watched her for a moment. I felt something move through me. Not anger exactly, more like recognition, like seeing a photograph of a place you used to live. Then I heard my name. Nora. I turned and there was Marcus. Marcus Osi. I'd met him 4 months earlier through a mutual friend at a completely unremarkable dinner in Strathcona. 6 people, a kitchen table, someone's excellent jollof rice. He was a civil engineer, calm and precise and funny in the specific way of someone who only says things they mean. We'd talked for 3 hours at that dinner and exchanged numbers and texted occasionally and had coffee twice, and I had been taking it slowly because I had learned, at real cost, what rushing felt like. He was there because he worked with one of the construction firms that had donated significantly to the hospital's capital campaign. He'd been invited weeks ago, he told me, and had debated coming, and had come partly because he knew I'd be there. I wasn't sure if I should say that, he added. It's okay, I said. I'm glad you did. We stood together at the edge of the room. He got us both a sparkling water. I told him about Patricia's daughter. He understood immediately, no explanation needed, and we talked about nothing consequential and everything real, the way you can sometimes with a person who has decided to pay attention to you. I don't know exactly when Claire saw me. I noticed it the way you notice someone staring, the prickle of awareness before you've identified the source. I looked over and she was looking directly at me. Her expression went through several things in about 2 seconds. Surprise, something harder to name. Then she looked at Marcus, who was standing beside me with his jacket sleeve just brushing my arm, and she went very still. She knew Marcus. That was the part I hadn't known, the part that neither of us had planned. They had worked together briefly years ago on a community infrastructure project. Claire had done a hospital administrative placement at the same organization. She had tried apparently to pursue something with him. He'd declined. This was all information I received later, quietly, and I want to be accurate about it here. I didn't know. Marcus didn't know I knew Claire. It was the kind of coincidence that only happens in a city of 2.5 million people that still manages to be 5 social circles wide. Daniel saw me a moment after Claire did. He leaned in and said something to her, and she gave a small, stiff nod. I turned back to Marcus. He was saying something about the seawall. We'd talked about running there, and I laughed at whatever it was, genuinely, because he was genuinely funny, and the laughter felt clean and unperformed and entirely mine. I did not look back at Claire. Later in the evening, she found me. I'd expected this, or something like it, and I wasn't afraid of it. She appeared at my elbow near the dessert table without Daniel, her voice careful. Nora. Hi. Hi, I said. I didn't know you'd be here. She was looking at Marcus, who had gone to speak with some of his colleagues. Here I am, I said. There was a pause. She started to say something. I think it was going to be one of the opening moves of an explanation, or an apology, or some rearrangement of the past into something more comfortable. And I realized, standing there in the Fairmont ballroom with a piece of chocolate torte on a small plate in my hand, that I didn't need to receive it. Claire, I said, I hope things are good for you. I meant it, or I was close enough to meaning it that the difference didn't matter. And then I turned and walked back toward Marcus, who saw me coming and shifted slightly to include me in the conversation he was having, and I stepped into that space and I stayed there. That's not a revenge story. I know that's not what the word usually means. Nobody lost anything publicly that night. Claire didn't drop her glass. There was no scene. My mother wasn't there. There was no announcement, no confrontation, no monologue I'd been rehearsing. What there was, a woman of 31 in a navy dress in a downtown Vancouver hotel, standing in a room where the people who had once made her feel small were watching her from across the room and not needing to do anything about it at all. That's what I'd built, in the worst year of my life, out of night shifts and seawall runs in bad weather and one new friend who left soup at the nursing station and one new person who came to a gala partly because he knew I'd be there. Not triumph, not revenge. Something quieter than that and harder to dismantle. My appointment, it turned out, wasn't with the people who'd hurt me. It was with the version of myself who didn't need them to know it. I used to think that what happened to me was the worst kind of loss, the kind where you lose several people at once and none of them leave loudly. Claire didn't storm out. Daniel didn't confess. My mother didn't pick a side dramatically. They all just quietly rearranged themselves into a version of my life that didn't include me, and I was the last one to find out. For a long time, I framed that as something that had been done to me, and it had been. I'm not going to soften that. But somewhere in the long, unglamorous months that followed, the Mount Pleasant bachelor apartment, the extra shifts, the seawall runs in the rain, I started to understand something that I don't think I could have learned any other way. The people who hurt you reveal something about your own life that you needed to see, not as a gift, not as a lesson handed down from somewhere, just as information. What you do with it is entirely yours. What Claire did wasn't just a betrayal of friendship, it was dishonest in the most complete way I know, not just to me, but to herself, to Daniel, to my mother who she pulled into it before I even knew what was happening. Dishonesty like that doesn't usually stay contained. It spreads into everything it touches, and eventually the people living inside it have to hold the weight of it every single day. I didn't need to do anything about that. I just needed to not be inside it anymore. What my mother did was harder to sit with because she's not a dishonest person. She's someone who valued a relationship, 12 years of Claire at our kitchen table, more than she valued being straight with me in the moment I most needed it. That's not malice. That's a failure of clarity. And I've come to believe that clarity is one of the harder things to maintain when you're emotionally attached to multiple people pulling in different directions. She failed at it. She's been working to do better. I've been letting her. The version of me that walked into that gala in November, the navy dress, the single glass of wine, the genuine laugh at something Marcus said, didn't get there by being lucky. She got there by making a series of very small, very undramatic decisions over about 14 months. Taking the charge nurse exam when I wasn't sure I was ready. Keeping the running schedule when it was dark and cold and pointless feeling. Calling my mother back in October when it would have been easier not to. Saying yes to a dinner in Strathcona when I was still rebuilding the instinct to show up. That's the part nobody tells you about getting through something like this. It isn't one big moment of deciding to be okay. It's 100 small ones where you choose to keep going anyway. Not because you feel strong, but because you understand that strength isn't a feeling. It's a practice. It's what you do at the Tuesday nights when nobody is watching and the situation isn't dramatic, and there's no audience for the effort. I think about Nora from February of last year sometimes, sitting in that Tim Hortons parking lot in Coquitlam watching a woman share a Timbit with her dog, trying to figure out how to carry all of it alone. I want to tell her that the carrying was the point, that nobody was coming to take the weight, that she was going to have to build the arms for it herself, and that she could and that she did. And that standing in a hotel ballroom 14 months later, not needing to say a single word to the people who had underestimated her, that was going to feel like more than enough.